All right, it's all about the IMF today as we take a look at the front page of today's This Day newspaper, Nigeria's newspaper of record. There it is on the front page. IMF backs the CBN's tough monetary policy and solicits a robust cybersecurity framework. As we know, the International Monetary Fund has concluded its Article IV consultation with Nigeria and released a robust report. This, of course, follows discussions that ended on February the 23rd, 2024, with officials of Nigeria on economic development and policies. And based on information available at the time of these discussions, the staff report was completed April the 9th of 2024. We're incredibly happy to have in our Lagos studios Christian Ebeke, who is the IMF Resident Representative for Nigeria. Good morning to you, sir. Thank you so much for joining us. And good to see you again after our NESG roundtable discussion way back. Kicking things off, social transfers. This is something that the report talks about, and scaling them. Can you speak to how the government can navigate that with, money supply issues, inflation also eating up the money that's being transferred? How can that work effectively?
Thank you, Otis. It's a pleasure to be here. I think on the social transfer issue, this is a key issue in the report as we cover it. We understand there is a lot of pain right now for Nigerians as these reforms are being implemented. You have a cost of living crisis with high inflation. Food inflation is 40%. And you have these policies that are being put in place, especially the direct payment to vulnerable households that the federal government has decided to basically revamp, right? And this is extremely timely because it helps to address one issue that is very, very important, which is food insecurity. It's one way of reducing the pain on vulnerable households, but it's also something that helps to complement the effort that you do on the reform front, right? Reforms take time before we can really bear the fruits, but in between, you have to think about putting together some guardrails to really, really help the most vulnerable, the one that cannot immediately take the full opportunities that the reform are able to bring. So we are fully confident that as these direct payments or this social transfer as put in scale or scaled up, this will bring tremendous help for the most vulnerable. This is very, very important at this particular juncture where Nigeria is implementing very, very challenging reforms. Nigeria, this administration inherited a lot of imbalances that built over the years. So now as they are unleashing the reform agenda, it's also very important to have these guardrails, these social guardrails, to make sure that the most vulnerables are not forgotten.
Thank you for that. The report also talks about, there's a really nice chart, we put it up, where it looks at the contributors towards high food inflation, which you've already mentioned at 40%. The report also talks about reopening the borders, and the report acknowledges that some of the land borders have been opened, but says more needs to be done. What can bring down this chart? What can bring down food inflation? Is it by opening the borders, getting more food imports? How do you see that dynamic working out?
I think it's a very good question. Food inflation, if you just take the item of food represents around 50% of the consumer price index basket, right? So this food is very, very big. It's a big portion of inflation. And around food, you have structural factors. You also have conjunctural factors. There is, for example, exchange rate depreciation. The pass-through towards inflation is also affecting food in the sense that, you import fertilizers, and as the naira is weaker, the naira cost of this fertilizer that you import is also going up. So this will definitely impact also food production and food prices. The same thing for transportation. You know that a lot of food is actually transported, and Nigeria is one of the countries with the highest post-harvest losses because, the product are not easily transported from the farm to the market. So in terms of food inflation, the strategy here, in our view, should really be to first make sure that monetary policy remains tight to bring overall inflation down. The second point is also addressing what are the structural impediments to food production in Nigeria. Agricultural productivity is one. And even when the products are produced, how do you ensure that post-harvest losses are also contained or minimized there? When we talk about the issue of land border, there's two things here. One is, of course, when you look at the situation with the naira is weaker compared to a few years ago. And this is clearly creating some competitiveness gains for local producer vis-a-vis the demand or the markets around Nigeria. For example, people in Benin can now afford Nigerian food product at a cheaper cost compared to. So this is a demand push that is coming from abroad. But at the same time, we think that banning food export has to be carefully implemented, because you don't want really tit-for-tat retaliation with your trading partners. You also have to make sure that you create sufficient guardrails to ensure that trade can continue to flow between countries in the region. We at the IMF, we promote global trade. So our view here will really be to make sure that these remain consistent with this objective of promoting global trade and stability.
Now, on the exchange rate, you've commented on the moves that have been made towards trying to stabilize it, but you've seen the volatility, the Naira going from like as low as 1,800 to the dollar, coming back down to 1,100, now it's at 1,004, and I love this chart that you guys put in your report showing the official rate, 3-month forward rate, and the parallel market rate. You can see how things have been moving, and you've also highlighted the JP Morgan, but great chart. Should we accept this volatility as part of where we're trying to get to, or can anything be done to temper it down?
So I think you have to start first by understanding what is driving movements in the Naira, right? So you have a central bank that has committed to transition towards inflation targeting. And by doing that, it implies that the exchange rate will not longer be the main goal of the central bank policy action. It's inflation. Inflation is the goal. So because you are refocusing your attention to inflation, it means that the exchange rate will now play a much bigger role as a shock absorber. So exchange rate flexibility is becoming something that I think Nigerian will have to start learning how to live with it, right? And this is what is being seen in many other countries, where as they transition towards inflation targeting, one of the implications is that the exchange rate becomes more flexible. Now, within the flexibility, you have two regimes. You have a regime of flexibility where, exchange rate movements reflect the fundamentals of the economy. So the Naira can be stronger this month and weaker the next month or the next quarter. So this is all fine. This is just reflective of a market that is functioning well, but also an economy that is moving up or down depending on the shocks. Then you have the second regime of flexibility, which is when the Naira is affected by speculation, or the Naira is affected by what we call disorderly market conditions. So in that specific regime that you have identified, a central bank intervention can happen. So the central bank can come and defend the currency on the way up or the way down. So this intervention must be symmetric, and this intervention must be transparent. So ex post, after the intervention, the central bank can communicate what was the size of the intervention and the purpose. This intervention also must be temporary. There should not be a substitute for what you really have to do in terms of macroeconomic adjustment. And in terms of adjustment, what we are saying in our report is that fiscal and monetary policy really have to be coordinated in a way to bring down inflation. It's not only monetary policy tightening that can bring inflation down. You also need fiscal policy to work in the same direction for many reasons. One source of inflation in Nigeria for many years has been the monetization of the deficit. The fact that a big part of the fiscal deficit was financed by direct transfer from the central bank. Now we understand that this policy or this strategy has been terminated, and we are very pleased to know that this is a new direction of travel. But fiscal and monetary policy coordination are extremely important to make sure that you bring some stability in terms of inflation, and that stability will automatically also trigger a much stable regime for the exchange rate.
Thank you so much. Excellent breakdown. We had a guest on the show, founder, chief analyst at Nairametrics, a well-read publication here in Nigeria and around the world, that said, if we can't, this is FDI now, if the authorities, fiscal authorities, cannot mobilize about $10 billion by the end of the year, then speculators are just going to go after the currency. What do you make of that debate as to how much? I don't know, maybe you don't want to put a number to it, but the discussion around how much FDI needs to come in to stabilize things, what do you make of that discussion?
I think the issue of the financial account in Nigeria is a very important issue. Nigeria is a big and very large economy. Nigeria is a big player in Africa. and inflows and outflows of Nigeria are of significant scale, right? We are talking about a country with a very, very sizable financial account. The strategy so far has been to tighten monetary policy, and by increasing the return on Naira-denominated securities, we have seen portfolio inflows coming in. And this has liquefied the FX market and helped provide movement towards more Naira stability. If you compare now the intraday trade in the Naira in the NAFEM, you can see a very narrowing gap now compared to 12 months ago or 10 months ago. Now, in terms of FDI, remember, in the financial account, you have different categories of capital flows. So the FPI are coming in now, attracted by higher return. You also want, as you continue to deploy the reforms, the structural reforms on trade, on the real economy, but also as you're coordinating your fiscal and monetary policy, you're restoring macroeconomic stability. These two will gradually convince foreign investors to take a longer-term position on Nigeria. So far, the investors that have been coming in since the monetary policy tightening have come for 12 months maturity, 24 months, which is already something that you also need in terms of liquefying the NAFEM and bringing additional FX inflows. But to sustain growth in the medium to long run, you then need the other form of capital. You need FDI. And the global landscape for FDI has been shaken a little bit recently because of geoeconomic fragmentation, right? So it's very important that Nigeria seize this opportunity to rethink the strategy for how to bring and attract this FDI, given the movement that we see around the world, FDI leaving certain countries for geopolitical reason and seeking other destinations. We think that with the right policy implementation, the right coordination of policies, and structural reform that really promote trade and the business environment, including in the oil sector and the gas sector, Nigeria is able to really tap on the huge potential that this country has.
Thank you so much. I know you are pressed for time. Just two more big issues I just want you to touch on. Fuel subsidies and minimum wage. Fuel subsidies first. The report talks about how the administration was commended for making the brave decision to partially remove them, but so far we've seen an implicit return of fuel subsidies. I know it's a touchy subject around the country because of cost of living, but I mean, I've argued it should just be yanked and then you should just have to take care of things. But your report also said that on the other side, something needs to be done to, minimize the blow of taking out. So what do we need to do here as far as the fuel subsidy?
I think, Rotus, while reading our report, you will realize that there is one common theme, which is the theme of sequencing and packaging, right? When it comes to the issue of fuel subsidies or electricity subsidy in general, just the fact that, the price that consumer pay is below what is the cost recovery price, we call it implicit subsidy, you have to take into account two things. First, our position is that you have to deliver on a robust social protection system. You have to deliver on social transfer. You have to accelerate or scale up this social transfer to make sure that people affected by this potential increase in the cost of living or the prices of essential product can be really helped out. So strengthening the assistance to the most vulnerable will have to come first before you then phase out these costly subsidies that are untargeted and really don't benefit necessarily the most vulnerable, the people who need it the most. So this is clearly our position. Is a position where we put more emphasis on delivering assistance to the most vulnerable now. So this is a sequencing. You start with that. And once you have a system that is robust enough and the targeting is done and you have reached out to the people most in need, then you phase out the fuel and other subsidies. So this is the type of guardrails that we are building around the policy recommendation that we put in place. Reform takes time. We fully understand a lot of pain that Nigeria faces now. This report talks about the trade-offs. It talks about how in environment faced with multiple shocks and challenges and limited fiscal space, how do you recalibrate policy? How do you sequence them better in order to make sure that you can continue with the reform momentum, but also carrying the population along with you while you are delivering on the difficult reform that you have to do.
Excellent stuff. And again, encouraging everyone to download that from the IMF website and go through it. Great. But final question for you, sir. I had a bit of a sparring session yesterday with the president of one of the labor unions, Comrade Joe Ajero. He was kind of arguing for, or just trying to justify 615,000 naira minimum wage. I don't know, I'll put you on the spot on what number it should be, but what do you weigh in on on the minimum wage discussion in Nigeria?
I think our understanding is that these negotiations happen every 4 to 5 years in Nigeria, so it's already good to have a framework and a timeline that exists for this important negotiation. The second point I want to make is, while these negotiations are taking place, it's true that different players or stakeholders involved in those negotiations will come with different positions. This is the purpose of a negotiation, by the way. Of course, the workers would like to see their wage go up. And the reason is very simple, is that the cost of living has gone up. The Nigeria Bureau of Statistics has a very important and interesting index that they call the cost of a healthy diet. It's a new index that they put together. If you look at this cost of healthy diet, it has gone up tremendously. So workers will or are already demanding higher wages. The second player there will be the companies, right? The question is whether the companies will be able to meet the new demand for higher wage by the workers. And then you also have the government, who is also an employer, and the government also has to balance whether this is feasible, how much fiscal space it is in there in order to meet this. So once these three stakeholders are discussing and trying to converge to a level that will satisfy everyone, there will be compromise, right? Negotiation can only reach to be terminated or end a very coherent place or point when these three players have converged and have agreed on something. The point I want to make is this increase in the minimum wage will also have to bring the central bank to be very close and monitor the situation, right? Because the increase in the minimum wage can have, depending on the size and depending on how productivity goes, can also have an inflationary impact. So the central bank will have to monitor this development in the labor market very seriously. This is what is happening in many countries in the world when those negotiations take place. But we think that the ongoing negotiation will likely lead to a point where different parties will agree, and the macroeconomic implication of the agreement will have to be carefully assessed and balanced accordingly.
Christian Ebeke, IMF representative for Nigeria, thank you so much for taking the time to come talk to us. Again, fantastic report. I've read it. I'm going to read it again. We encourage everybody to download it. Thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate your time.